Chapter 16, Still Knitting. Some of you may have noticed that I posted this video last week and I took it down over the weekend, and I'm reposting it now because I realized I missed a couple key annotations that I wanted to point out to you. So we're going to do this one over. I just want to remind you that we are still in Paris, still knitting with Madame Defarges, and just to remind you what happened in chapter 15, the mender of roads had been taken to see the king and queen, where he made a complete fool of himself, bowing down to them, and Madame Defarges was not impressed. But Monsieur Defarges felt that perhaps it was a good thing that he was creating, a belief that the people loved the king and queen, which would be good for the revolutionaries. It would help reduce some of the suspicion around them. But at this point now, they are ushering him home. So Madame Defarges and Monsieur returned amicably to the bosom of Saint Antoine, while a speck in a blue cap toiled through the darkness and through the dust and down the weary miles of the avenue by the wayside, slowly tending towards that point of the compass where the chateau of Monsieur the Marquis, now in his grave, listened to the whispering trees. Again, we're personifying the house. So they have walked him to the edge of Paris and gotten him through the gate, and they're sending him on his way. It does talk here a lot about the stone faces, and this is something I wanted to be sure and point out because it could be a quiz question. It's talking about the stone faces that were around, or still are around, this chateau, and it's saying that when the knife had struck home, meaning like when the knife hit Monsieur the Marquis, the faces changed from faces of pride to faces of anger and pain. So this is representing how the aristocracy in general would have responded or felt about the killing of the Marquis. And also, when that dangling figure was hauled up 40 feet above the fountain, they changed again and bore a cruel look of being avenged, which they would henceforth bear forever. So this is indicating that the stone faces, like the aristocracy, would have felt victorious in the killing by hanging of Gaspard, who is the one who murdered the Marquis. So it says here that there's rumors that the stone faces are, representing the aristocracy, which basically means that the villagers know that the aristocracy is, a big monster, really. I mean, it's just like defining all of France, and that these feelings are everywhere in society. So it goes on here to talk about that, the face, the dangling figure, the red stone on the stone, or the red stain on the stone floor, which is where the blood of the Marquis went. All of France itself lay under the night sky, concentrated into a faint hairbreadth line. So does a whole world with all its greatness and littleness lie in a twinkling star. And as mere human knowledge can split a ray of light and analyze the manner of its composition, so sublimer intelligence may read in the feeble shining of this earth of ours every thought and act, every vice and virtue of every responsible creature on it. So this is referring to Newton, Isaac Newton, 200 years before Dickens wrote this book. So this was in 1672, had discovered that light, which looks white to the eye, is actually made up of a spectrum of lights, and that's what this is referring to. And there's a comparison here between our Earth and how small it is in the great vast universe, but that it has these same complexities that people can recognize. So the Defarges come home after escorting the mender of roads to the edge of town, and they have to pass through the gate. It says there was the usual stoppage at the barrier guardhouse, and the usual lanterns came glancing forth for the usual examination and inquiry. So everybody coming and going from the city is questioned. Monsieur Defarges alighted, knowing one or two of the soldiery there and one of the police. So this indicates that there's like an inside circle of revolutionaries. The latter he was intimate with, so this is clearly someone who's part of the Jacquerie, and affectionately embraced. When Saint Antoine had again enfolded the Defarges in his dusky wings, and they, having finally alighted near the saint's boundaries, were picking their way on foot through the black mud, Madame Defarge says, "Say then, my friend, what did Jacques of the police tell thee?" So this is an acknowledgement that the policeman is part of the revolutionary effort. And I do like this metaphor here of Saint Antoine having wings that it folds around these people. And he says that there's a spy commissioned for our quarter. So he is informing the Defarges that a new spy is coming into their neighborhood. And in fact, there are lots of spies. We're going to see references again in this chapter. There were spies everywhere during this time, but he's clearly an informant, which is helpful. Madame Defarge says, "Is it necessary to register him? How do they call the man?" So remember, registering is basically putting him on a target list, somebody who is part of the aristocracy or against the revolutionary effort. And Monsieur Defarge says he is English. His name is Barsad, actually John Barsad. So if you remember, John Barsad was in the trial of Charles Darnay. He's the one who testified against him and said that he was a spy, that he was treasonous, that he was sending secret messages back and forth. So this is the spy coming into Saint Antoine. So he asks, or Madame Defarge asks, to describe what he looks like. How would we know him? And this is what she learns, that Barsad is about 40 years old. He's about 5'9". He has black hair. He has dark complexion. He's rather handsome. He has dark eyes, a long, thin face, a sallow sort of undertone to his skin, which is sort of a yellowing, sort of, lack of color a little bit. Aquiline nose, but not straight, having a peculiar inclination toward the left cheek, an expression therefore sinister. So this reference to having like a nose that's a little crooked to the left is a sort of a sign that someone has evil intentions. And so the Madame says, "Oh, that's really quite an excellent description. He shall be registered tomorrow," which means that she will knit him in to whatever it is she's knitting, some symbol or actually maybe even possibly the letters of his name. He will be knitted in to her register. So they get into their wine shop. It's late. It's midnight, it says here. By the way, these could be quiz questions. The few people who are in there, she tells them it's time to go to bed, and she sends them on their way. And then she collects the money that has been left for the drink while they were gone, and she knots them up in her handkerchief in a chain of separate knots for safekeeping through the night. So this could also be a quiz question, and it's just an interesting thing that she does. She's careful about the money. She knows that it could be stolen. So all this time, Monsieur Defarge has his pipe in his mouth, and he's restless. He's walking up and down. And his wife says, "You are fatigued." And her husband acknowledges he's a little tired. And Madame Defarge says, "You are a little depressed too." And then she sort of makes fun of him, like, "Oh, the men, they're so sensitive." She's kind of dissing him for being, melancholy. And he argues back with her. He says, "My dear," and she says, "But my dear, you are faint of heart tonight." And then he says, "Well, it is a long time." And so he's getting restless that it's taking so long for this revolution to happen. And she says, "Well, vengeance and retribution require a long time. It doesn't happen overnight." And he argues back that, well, it doesn't take a long time to strike a man with lightning. But she argues that, well, actually, it takes a long time to store the lightning, to make the lightning. And on the next page, she gives another example that it also takes a long time to make an earthquake. So things that are destructive take time to create. And he acknowledges that that's true. And she says, "Listen," and she kind of gives him a little bit of a lecture. "Although it is a long time on the road, it is on the road and coming. I tell thee it never retreats and never stops. I tell thee it is always advancing. Look around and consider the lives of all the world that we know. Consider the faces of all the world that we know. Consider the rage and discontent of which the Jacquerie addresses itself with more and more certainty every hour. Can such things last? Bah, I mock you." She's like, "It's building. It's going to happen." "My brave wife," returned Defarge, "I do not question all this, but it has lasted a long time, and it is possible, well, my wife, it is possible, that it may not come during our lives. So he's afraid that it will happen after they're dead, that maybe it's going to take so long that they won't actually see the revolution. And this could also be a quiz question. And she says, well, you know, what, like, if we don't see the triumph, she says, you know, nothing that we have done is done in vain. I believe with all my soul that we shall see it. She believes they'll live to see it. But if not, even if I knew certainly not, show me the neck of an aristocrat and tyrant, and still I would. And then she sets her teeth and ties a terrible knot indeed. So it's just a really great representation, description of how ruthless she is and how evil she is. And Defarge says, hold, I too, my dear, will stop at nothing. So he's trying to show her, like, you're not the only brave one. I'm brave too. But he gets criticized. Madame Defarge says, yes, but it is your weakness that you sometimes need to see your victim and your opportunity to sustain you. Sustain yourself without that. When the time comes, let loose a tiger and a devil. But wait for the time with the tiger and the devil chained, not shown, yet always ready. So another possible quiz question here, like she's saying his weakness is he needs to see his victim. She's saying you need to be patient and believe that you have the power ready when you need it. And then she goes on she emphasizes this statement by striking her little counter with her chain of money as if she knocked its brains out, and then gathering the heavy handkerchief under her arm in a serene manner and observing that it was time to go to bed. I have a note here that she reminds me of Lady Macbeth. I don't know if any of you have read that. You probably will at some point, but Lady Macbeth was a ruthless, very brave woman, at least in the beginning of the play. And Macbeth himself was a little bit more questioning about how he should be managing revenge. So the next morning, they get up. So they've gone to bed. The next day they get up, and a few people come in, sort of having a drink or not, hanging out. It's probably just the local people. And all of a sudden, Madame Defarge notices that there's a shadow on her, and she lays down her knitting and began to pin her rose in her headdress before she looked at the figure. It was curious. The minute she looks up, the customers ceased talking and began to gradually leave the wine shop. So just make a note of that. The newcomer says, good day, madame. And she says, good day, monsieur. And then she says aloud, you know, good day, monsieur. But then she says to herself, ha, good day, age about 40, height about 5'9", black hair, generally rather handsome visage, complexion dark, eyes dark, thin, long and sallow face, aquiline nose but not straight, having a peculiar inclination towards the left cheek, which imparts a sinister expression. Good day, one and all. So she recognizes right away it's the spy, John Barsad. So they proceed to have a very fake conversation. John Barsad asks for a glass of cognac. He compliments the cognac, which we can assume is not the greatest in the world, given how poor everybody is. It's the first time it's ever been complimented, and Madame Defarge knows that that's a fake compliment. And he compliments her knitting and says, oh, it's a pretty pattern. And Madame Defarge says, you think so? Because if you remember, she's probably knitting his name right into that pattern or some symbol that would represent him. And he asks what her knitting is for, and she says, it's just for pastime. And he says, not for use. And she says, maybe, maybe someday I'll use it, but it doesn't really matter. It was remarkable, but the taste of Saint Antoine seemed to be decidedly opposed to a rose on the headdress of Madame Defarge. Two men had entered separately and had been about to order a drink when, catching sight of that novelty, they faltered, made a pretense of looking about as if for some friend who was not there, and they went away. So what I want you to make sure you understand here is that she puts the rose in her scarf on her head when there's somebody in the wine shop who is suspicious. It's a way to signal to customers that there could be a spy and that people should stop talking openly about things. And people recognize that, and so they're leaving. And so as she keeps knitting, Madame thinks that she will have his whole name, John and Barsad, knitted before he leaves. She goes on to say, "You have a husband, Madame?" And she says, "Yes." "Children?" "No." He asks if business is bad. "Yeah, of course it is, because everybody's poor." She says, "Business is very bad and the people are so poor." And John Barsad says, "Oh, so oppressed too, as you say." Well, of course, she didn't say oppressed. "As you say," Madame retorted, because she didn't say it. "Pardon me, certainly it was I who said so, but you naturally think so, of course." "I think," returned Madame in a high voice. "I and my husband have enough to do to keep this wine shop open without thinking. All we think here is how to live. That is a subject we think of, and it gives us from morning to night enough to think about without embarrassing our heads concerning others." So she's like, we don't have time for that. We just think about ourselves. He goes on then to broach the delicate subject he wants to get information about. And he says, "Oh, a bad business of Gaspard's execution. Poor Gaspard." And Madame Defarge says, "Well, if people kill other people, they're going to get hung." Like, she's like, that's what the law says. Like, whatever. He asked for it. And John Barsad says, "Well, I do believe there's much compassion and anger in this neighborhood touching on the poor fellow." And she's like, "Is there?" Like, she doesn't know. And then in comes Monsieur Defarge. "Here is my husband." And John Barsad says, "Good day, Jacques." Defarge stopped short and stared at him. "Good day, Jacques," the spy repeated with not quite so much confidence or quite so easy a smile. And Monsieur Defarge says, "You deceive yourself, monsieur. You mistake me for another. That is not my name. I am Ernest Defarge." So this is the first time we get Defarge's real name. It is Ernest. Remember back in book 1, in chapter 5, he tells the Jacques 1, Jacques 2, and Jacques 3 that his name is Jacques 2. And at that time, as a reader, we don't really know if that's actually his name. But by this point, we know, because he's told us earlier that he is Jacques 4, and the Mender of Rose would be Jacques 5, that is a code name for a revolutionary, just like Jacques the policeman. So this could be a quiz question. His name is Ernest. And Ernest, in its meaning, means that someone is truthful and that they are genuine in their feelings and they express themselves honestly. So that is his name. So Barsad goes on to say he was just telling Madame Defarge that there's much sympathy and anger in Saint Antoine about Gaspard, and Defarge says the same thing. I know nothing of it, basically. And he keeps pushing. He says, "The pleasure of conversing with you, Monsieur Defarge, recalls to me that I have the honor of cherishing some interesting associations with your name." So he's now floating another conversation starter here, because he's completely run up against a brick wall with this Gaspard stuff. Neither Monsieur nor Madame Defarge are going to talk to him about the death of Gaspard. So the next thing that Barsad says is that he is aware of Dr. Manette. He says that when Dr. Manette was released, you, his old domestic, had the charge of him. I know. He was delivered to you. You see, I am informed of the circumstances. And Defarge is like, well, okay, I can't deny this. I mean, yes, that's true. And then the spy says, it was to you that his daughter came, and it was from your care that his daughter took him, accompanied by a neat brown monsieur, this would be Mr. Lorry, of the Bank of Tellson's, over to England. So he's like, I even know that like Lucy and Mr. Lorry came and took Dr. Manette to London. And he says, I know that Dr. Manette and his daughter, I have known Dr. Manette and his daughter in England. Of course, we know that that's because he was at the trial, giving evidence against Charles Darnay. And so Defarge just kind of keeps playing along. Oh, yes, okay, that's a fact, whatever. And the spy says, do you hear much about them now? And Defarge says no. And then Madame Defarge breaks in, because I'm sure she's afraid that Defarge is going to say something he's not supposed to say. And so she says, actually, we never hear about them. We heard about them a little bit when they first left, but we have held no correspondence. So we have not continued to correspond with them. And Barsad said she's going to be married. So this is the first we've heard of it as a reader. And Madame says, going? Well, she was pretty enough to have been married long ago. You English are cold. So she's like, wow, English people take a long time to fall in love. And John Barsad says, oh, I'm English? So this is interesting because they had been told by the police that he was English. But she also covers herself by saying, well, I perceive your accent, and if you have an accent that's English, I'm going to assume that you're English too. So he goes on to say, after he references, oh, poor Gaspard, she says that Miss Manette, or he says, Miss Manette is going to be married to an Englishman, but who, like herself, is French. It's a curious thing that she is going to marry the nephew of Monsieur the Marquis, for whom Gaspard was exalted to that height of so many feet. In other words, the present Marquis, but he lives unknown in England. He is no Marquis there. He is Mr. Charles Darnay. Darnay is the name of his mother's family. So this is key details here. It's an important detail just to confirm that now everybody knows that Charles Darnay is the nephew of the Marquis who was killed and that he has officially inherited that property. And we get some detail about the name. Darnay, which sounds very similar to Darnay, was his mother's maiden name. So Madame Defarges knitted steadily, but this intelligence had a palpable effect upon Monsieur Defarges. So she can keep her cool, but he is shaken by this news. Of course, he never knew that Charles Darnay was related to the Marquis. He is so nervous, Monsieur Defarges, that when he tries to light his pipe, his hand is shaky. And the spy would have been no spy at all if he had failed to see it. So he has certainly gotten some information about this situation just by seeing Monsieur Defarges' reaction. He's like, oh, okay, like this is going to be an issue. This is going to cause a problem for these people. So they managed to get him to leave because he can't get anything else out of them. And he leaves. And then Monsieur Defarges is really shocked. He says to Monsieur Defarges, can it be true what he said of Mademoiselle Manette? And Madame Defarges says, well, it's probably false because it came out of the mouth of a spy, but it may be true. And he says, well, if it is, and she says, if it is, he says, and if it does come while we live to see it triumph, I hope for her sake, destiny will keep her husband out of France. So he's saying, like, if the revolution does happen in our lifetime, he better stay in England because if he comes here, he'll be a target. As the inheritance, all that property belongs to him. Her husband's destiny, says Madame Defarges, will take him where he is to go and will lead him to the end that is to end him. That is all I know. So she has no feeling for him. She's like, if he gets here and he's killed, then that's just the way it's going to be. So we see a difference here. She is ruthless. He is sensitive. He cares about these people. He doesn't want Darnay to get killed. But it's very strange, says Defarges, that after all our sympathy for Monsieur, her father, and herself, her husband's name should be prescribed under your hand at this moment. So he's saying, like, we have positive interactions with these people, and you're in the process of knitting Darnay into your knitting. So that's how quickly Madame Defarges starts, identifying people as aristocratic targets. And she says, I have them both here. They are both here for their merits because they're aristocrats, and that's all it is. So she doesn't care about their personal history with this family. She really only cares that he's an aristocrat now and that therefore he is on the list to be killed. She rolls up her knitting. She takes the rose out of her handkerchief that was wound around her head, and then everybody comes back in. So this is clearly that symbol that, the spy is gone. So all the women knitted. It goes on to talk here about not just Madame Defarge, but all the women in Saint Antoine knitted. They knitted worthless things, but the mechanical work was a mechanical substitute for eating and drinking. The hands moved for the jaws and the digestive apparatus. If the bony fingers had been still, the stomachs would have been more famine pinched. So this is actually like a true historical reference that during this time, this is all the women did, was knit, because it was the only way to pass the time and to do something with their hands to help them cope with their physical suffering because they had so much want. So Monsieur Defarge looks at his wife and he thinks, she's a great woman, a frightfully grand woman. So this is an example, Monsieur Defarge is an example of a foil. I don't know if any of you have been taught this term here, but a foil is a character that is very one-dimensional. It's a character who is static. So meaning that, he doesn't change, or she doesn't really change throughout the book. And he has like certain characteristics that are a polar opposite of another character. So he is a foil to Madame Defarge because he is the complete opposite of her. He is sensitive. He is, earnest in his intentions. She is ruthless. So that is the difference here. It goes on to talk about how they will continue knitting and knitting. And this kind of shifts now from a true historical reference to a greater metaphor that is going to foreshadow the revolution. Darkness encompassed them, meaning the knitters. Another darkness was closing in as surely when the church bells, then ringing pleasantly in many an airy steeple over France, should be melted into thundering cannon, when the military drums should be beating to drown a wretched voice, that night all potent as the voice of power and plenty, freedom and life. So much was closing in around the women who sat knitting and knitting that their very selves were closing in around a structure yet unbuilt, where they were to sit knitting, counting dropping heads. So this is the guillotine, which has not been built yet, but when the revolution starts, they will build a guillotine, and this is where they will chop off the heads of all of the aristocrats, and then women will sit and knit and watch. So the main thing here you want to keep in mind is Jean Barsad is the spy, that they learn that Monsieur the Marquis has a nephew who is living in England and who has inherited that land. So now he is actually a target for the revolution. And we have this other reference to the symbol of the rose, which is what Madame Defarge puts in her hair when there's a spy in the wine shop.